The roar at Sepang wasn't just the sound of engines, it was the sound of something breaking inside a champion. Under the suffocating Malaysian heat, Francesco Pecco Bagnaia's Ducati GP25 shimmered like a weapon forged in perfection yet trembling with rebellion. Every rev was a heartbeat, every downshift a confession. For 12 flawless laps, man and machine were one continuous equation: torque, traction, telemetry, until a microscopic piece of carbon pierced that harmony and rewrote destiny in the span of a heartbeat. From the pit wall, the data feed bled red, tire pressure collapsing lap by lap, a silent countdown no human ear could hear. But what shattered wasn't rubber, it was faith. The rider who once embodied control now fought ghosts both mechanical and moral: a puncture, a paddock divided, and the sight of helicopters carrying fallen Moto3 riders while the show went on. When he spoke, the words cut deeper than any lap time. It's not a perfect idea. I'll never understand it. Bagnaia wasn't raging at fate. He was rebelling against a sport that had forgotten to feel. Ducati's engineers traced numbers. Pecco traced conscience. Between the cold logic of telemetry and the heat of empathy, the world saw the human circuitry beneath the visor flicker. That night, as the pit lane lights dimmed and the data screens went black, the air still hummed with something beyond horsepower. The sound of a champion realizing that speed means nothing when the soul loses traction. And in that single instant, MotoGP's most precise rider became its most unpredictable story. And as the echoes of that broken harmony faded beneath Sepang's burning sky, the story of Pecco Bagnaia's unraveling began, not with rage, but with the quiet precision of a man determined to rebuild perfection one lap at a time. Francesco Pecco Bagnaia arrived in Malaysia carrying the weight of a season that had bruised both ego and machine, but the air at Sepang was heavy with the sin of redemption. The Ducati GP25 shimmered beneath the tropical sun, its scarlet fairing trembling with restrained fury, as if aware that its rider needed salvation more than speed. Engineers whispered about tire degradation curves, fuel load distribution, and a new swing arm geometry tested in Barcelona but never trusted until now. He listened, nodded, and then silenced the noise with a deep breath that felt like swallowing lightning. We didn't have the best Friday, he admitted with that quiet defiance familiar to champions. But on Saturday I got pole, won the sprint, and today I was fighting for podium. It was definitely a positive weekend. His voice was even, but behind the visor his pulse ticked faster than the pit wall's telemetry feed. In the paddock, the Marquez brothers grinned like ghosts of inevitability, but Pecco's world narrowed to a single red light flickering above the grid. When it vanished, he launched like a loaded spring, front tire clawing the humid air, Desmosedici roaring through first gear with perfect traction control modulation at 14,700 revolutions per minute. For 8 laps, he rode as if he had reprogrammed gravity itself, each corner an act of precision so fine it felt mathematical. The new Brembo calipers bit harder, and the electronics package translated instinct into velocity with surgical obedience. Yet, deep inside, a whisper grew. Don't trust it. Don't trust the quiet. The asphalt felt warmer than expected. The rear compound began to soften at turn 9, data that would later haunt Ducati's debrief screens. Pecco noticed the sensation of the bike breathing differently, the feedback from the seat turning hollow like the sound of a cracked bell. Still, he pressed on, his rhythm hypnotic, his throttle hand painting invisible arcs of defiance. A journalist watching from pit lane compared his style to poetry written at 330 kilometers per hour, each stanza measured by tire pressure and courage. But poetry, like machinery, is fragile when stretched too far. The rear began to slide, softly first, then with a subtle vibration that traveled up through the pegs into his bones. He thought it was temperature drift, maybe a telemetry glitch, and kept the pace steady. Maybe it's nothing, he told himself. Maybe it's just the bike breathing again. But the truth was already carving itself into the rubber, a puncture so small it mocked physics until it claimed his destiny. 3 laps from the end, his perfect weekend began to bleed air, and with it, belief. For 12 laps, the Sepang circuit had belonged entirely to Pecco Bagnaia. The red Ducati carved through the heat like a blade through silk, telemetry tracing perfection in digital ink across the team's monitors. From the pit wall, the engineers watched his rhythm with the cautious optimism of men who'd learned that brilliance can turn to chaos without warning. Then a flicker, a subtle dip in rear pressure readings that barely registered as danger. Unfortunately, we saw from the data that the puncture came on lap 12, and lap after lap, it was losing pressure. Pecco would later explain, comba hollow. The GP25, so stable in its balance, began whispering different stories through the chassis. The swing arm flex felt softer. The rear sensor lagged by fractions of a second, but at 300 kilometers per hour, fractions are fates. On the straights, the engine screamed beautifully, yet in corners it muttered betrayal. Honestly, I thought I hadn't managed the rear tire well, because I suddenly started to feel really low on grip, he confessed, the humility of the quote hiding the panic of the moment. Every corner exit became a question, every lean angle a negotiation. Inside his helmet, a voice murmured, "Hold the line, just hold the line. It's probably temperature drift." The tire, wounded by a piece of carbon debris no wider than a thumbnail, exhaled its life with the quiet patience of a dying thing. The data stream turned red, 1 pixel at a time, and the crew could do nothing but watch the numbers fall like a slow countdown. Michelin technicians later confirmed that pressure had dropped to 0.6 bar before the system even flagged the failure, a delay that made recovery impossible. Pecco's wrists began to ache from compensating, his throttle hand trembling between faith and surrender. The rear of the bike danced where it once sang, each slide stealing a heartbeat. Sweat ran down his neck, salt mixing with disbelief, as he wondered how perfection could deflate so quickly. "It's a bit of bad luck. Unfortunately, it's racing, and it can happen," he said later, but the simplicity of his words disguised the brutality of truth. A puncture is invisible until it destroys everything, like a secret flaw in a diamond. The Ducati limped toward the pits, and the man inside the helmet stopped being a champion for a moment. He was just human, chasing a miracle that had already slipped away. The hole in the tire was small, but the silence it left behind was endless. When Bagnaia rolled the GP25 into the Ducati garage, the silence was heavier than the engine's dying echo. The crew didn't move at first. They just stared at the monitor that still flickered with a red data trace diving into nothingness. One mechanic removed his headset as if undressing from disbelief. The bike hissed softly, metal cooling like skin after a fever. Michel Pirot stepped forward, eyes half lowered, and offered the line that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "Awareness, don't forget it." Pecco looked up, expression unreadable, his jaw clenched so tightly it could have crushed the radio mic between his teeth. Inside, the words burned. "Awareness? After 3 DNFs, I'm drowning in awareness." The engineers spoke in cautious fragments about rear load transfer imbalance and inconsistent pressure readings, but the air smelled not of fuel, only of frustration. The GP25's telemetry, they said, had shown erratic feedback from the rear potentiometer, a microscopic signal delay that distorted grip data by 0.08 seconds. That was all it took to make a world champion question everything. Pecco sat on the pit wall, gloves half off, watching mechanics circle the machine like doctors around a body they couldn't revive. A bead of sweat fell from his temple onto the tank, a single drop that carried the entire weight of the weekend. His thoughts drifted to the sprint race, the effortless flow, the confidence, now shattered like a mirror in motion. "Although I scored fewer points than an MGI, I leave Sepang with clearer ideas," he told reporters moments later, voice steady but soul fraying. The quote sounded rational, even optimistic, yet inside his head it echoed with irony. The garage smelled of burnt rubber and lost certainty. Outside, journalists waited, lenses pointed like questions no one wanted to answer. A small gust of hot Malaysian air swept through the paddock and lifted a piece of tire debris off the floor, spinning it briefly before it disappeared beneath a workbench. For a heartbeat, the entire scene looked suspended, mechanics frozen, monitors flickering, hope evaporating. Then, as if the world exhaled at once, someone killed the lights over his bike. In that instant, the red glow of Ducati pride dimmed to something quieter, more human, and infinitely more fragile. The morning sky over Sepang looked harmless, pale blue and innocent, but what unfolded during the Moto3 sighting lap tore through that illusion like glass under pressure. 2 young riders collided at turn 3, their machines spinning into silence, and the paddock froze as rescue teams sprinted toward the wreckage. Helicopters lifted off, blades cutting the humid air, scattering dust over the garages as if erasing certainty itself. In the Ducati corner, Bagnaia watched the monitors in stunned silence, hands locked, visor still on. Moments later, when race direction announced that the Moto3 race would restart, disbelief hardened into anger. "It's not a perfect idea," he said firmly, voice steady but threaded with disbelief. "I'll never understand it." The comment hung in the air like static. Riders exchanged glances, mechanics avoided eye contact, and the broadcast screens flickered with forced optimism. Technically, the decision followed safety protocol, a new regulation stating that if medical evacuation clears within 30 minutes, the race may proceed, but no clause accounted for empathy. Pecco's mind spiraled. How can we talk about lap times when two boys just left in helicopters? His boots felt heavier than ever, as if morality had weight. Every sound, a torque gun, a shutter click, the dull roar of another warm-up lap grated against his sense of decency. Around him, Ducati engineers continued with quiet efficiency, checking tire pressures, recalibrating sensors, pretending the world outside the garage made sense. But Pecco's thoughts refused containment. They leaked into his veins like cold oil. Luckily, I'm not the one who has to make these decisions, he added bitterly, but I think things were done in a way I would not have done. There was no performance left in his tone, just exhaustion disguised as professionalism. A journalist nearby described his expression as haunted clarity, the look of a man who sees the price beneath the spectacle. In that moment, racing stopped being a sport and became a question without an answer. The pit lane was filled with motion, yet everything felt motionless. Somewhere, a marshal reset a digital clock, signaling the continuation of the schedule, as if time itself could erase conscience. And Bagnaia, staring at the runway where the helicopters had vanished, understood that speed had never felt so slow. When the microphones gathered around him that evening, Pecco Bagnaia was no longer the careful diplomat Ducati fans had known. His voice, stripped of its usual calm cadence, carried the tremor of moral fatigue rather than mechanical frustration. He looked straight into the cameras, eyes dark beneath the fluorescent glare of the hospitality tent. First of all, we have to talk about what happened in Moto3. That's the real problem, not a puncture, he said, each word measured like a torque wrench tightening on truth. The journalists exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing a shift, the moment when a champion stopped defending results and started defending conscience. Behind him, mechanics still disassembled the wounded GP25, scanning tire fragments for traces of carbon fiber, the autopsy of an irrelevant tragedy. The technical report confirmed what everyone already knew. The puncture had come from debris, not design. Yet Pecco's anger had drifted somewhere else entirely. How can we speak of luck when safety is treated like scheduling? He thought, his inner voice cracking under the weight of empathy. I'm very happy that Rueda is okay apart from a broken hand, but there is nothing official about the Byler. To let such young riders go again after that is not a good idea, he added, his tone low, his phrasing deliberate, like an indictment rather than a comment. The paddock went still. Ethics had suddenly entered the conversation like a cold wind through an open door. In a sport obsessed with precision, morality had no manual, no telemetry channel to read its drift. One Ducati technician whispered that Pecco was talking like a man who's seen too much data and too little humanity. The quote traveled across social media within minutes, triggering arguments that blurred sport and soul. Bagnaia's words weren't polished press talk. They were raw torque, unfiltered combustion from a man who'd hit his emotional rev limiter. A MotoGP insider later noted that his media briefing ran 12 minutes longer than scheduled, a small rebellion in a system timed to the second. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same stopwatch that measured lap records now measured grief. Reporters described his demeanor as clinical rage, the kind that dismantles myths more efficiently than machines. For a brief, electric instant, Sepang felt less like a racetrack and more like a courtroom where speed stood trial. And when Bagnaia walked away from the microphones, silence followed, the kind that lingers long after the engines stop. As if the puncture and the Moto3 outrage were not enough, another storm brewed quietly in the background, one born not of asphalt but of memory. MotoGP's media division, seeking nostalgia, had chosen that same weekend to release a documentary revisiting the Rossi-Marquez rivalry, a move that felt tone-deaf amid the chaos of Sepang. For most, it was just another streaming event. For Pecco Bagnaia, it was sacrilege. The date coincided with the anniversary of Marco Simoncelli's death, a wound that time had never truly cauterized in the Italian racing psyche. When asked about it, he exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing like shutter blades cutting light. Even the idea of releasing that documentary on the 6th anniversary was not very good. Roles were painted a little distorted. I was asked about it at the beginning of the year and said it wasn't appropriate. Honestly, I wouldn't have started the Moto3 race today. His tone was measured, but every syllable carried the weight of history, as if ghosts listened from the rafters of the paddock. The PR officials nearby shifted uncomfortably, They knew sentiment wasn't supposed to interfere with the weekend's commercial choreography. Ducati's data monitors blinked on behind him, recording tire pressures, brake temperatures, and lap simulations for a race that suddenly felt trivial. A young technician noticed the front brake temperature reading at 426 degrees Celsius and thought it strange how machinery burned hotter when men went cold. Inside his helmet case, Pecco's gloves still smelled of effort and something older, grief, perhaps, or disillusionment. Why do we keep racing over memories we never learned from? He wondered silently, though no one heard it. The circuit's humid air seemed to thicken with unspoken apologies. Outside, banners of Rossi and Marquez fluttered side by side like uneasy truce flags in the windless Malaysian afternoon. Reporters kept their questions cautious, aware they were stepping on emotional glass. Bagnaia's criticism wasn't rebellion. It was reverence misread as defiance. The cameras caught his expression, not anger, but an ache too complex for headlines. In a sport obsessed with milliseconds, timing had failed spectacularly. The irony was cruel. MotoGP, forever chasing progress, had stumbled into its own past. And in that clash between spectacle and soul, Bagnaia stood alone, the only man willing to remind a paddock that remembrance, too, deserves precision. By Sunday night, the lights in the Sepang paddock glowed like tired stars over an exhausted universe. The race was over, but the weight of the weekend still clung to the air, heavy and electric. Pecco Bagnaia sat alone on a folding chair beside the Ducati truck, helmet resting on his knees, visor half open like a confession he wasn't ready to make. Around him, mechanics packed crates and cables with the mute efficiency of soldiers cleaning up after a battle they hadn't chosen. The smell of hot brakes, fuel residue, and Malaysian rain lingered, a strange perfume of victory denied. He looked at the scuffed tires stacked nearby, black circles that had once promised control but now only whispered fragility. Maybe I'm a little too empathetic, he admitted quietly to the Italian journalist who dared approach, but seeing helicopters take off with 2 riders then racing after that, I'll never understand it. The words were simple, but they landed with the density of truth. Ducati's engineers nearby pretended to focus on data export, a line of numbers streaming from a laptop like unspoken emotions turned digital. The rear suspension's telemetry showed irregular damping oscillations, evidence of how hard he had ridden through the instability before the puncture. How many more weekends like this can I take before the bike starts riding me? He wondered, the thought flickering across his mind like static in a headset. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, fingers pale from the pressure of control. The paddock noise dimmed, replaced by the distant hum of generators and the occasional metallic sigh of cooling engines. Pecco's eyes drifted toward the empty grid beyond the pit wall, a stage both sacred and cruel. There was a fragility to his silhouette, the quiet geometry of a man holding too much composure for too long. Someone offered him a bottle of water. He didn't notice. One team member whispered about heading to Valencia for the test. Same settings, different ghost, he muttered. Bagnaia smiled faintly at the phrase, as if irony had become his last defense mechanism. Empathy, it turned out, was his sharpest edge and his heaviest burden. The night wrapped around him like a cooling tire blanket, soft but suffocating. And as the lights went out one by one, Pecco realized that exhaustion, not failure, was the true cost of greatness. Sepang 2025 will not be remembered for its victory laps or champagne spray, but for the moment a 2-time world champion's composure finally cracked under the glare of perfection. Francesco Bagnaia stood before the cameras, face drained, posture rigid, voice reduced to something fragile yet unyielding. Behind him, Ducati engineers moved like silhouettes, dismantling the GP25 as if taking apart a secret they no longer trusted. The air smelled of hot rubber and uncertainty. His words came measured, each one a shard of control. Although I scored fewer points than in MGI, I leave Sepang with clearer ideas, he said, but even he seemed unconvinced by the script his professionalism demanded. The statement lingered in the humid air, not as comfort but as survival instinct. For months, the factory team had leaned on his calm the way a storm leans on silence, but that silence had finally broken. Inside his helmet, earlier that day, he had thought, if this is what greatness costs, how much more am I willing to pay? Ducati's data logs later showed an anomaly in engine braking parameters, a tiny misalignment between mechanical and emotional equilibrium. Numbers couldn't capture what his eyes did. Exhaustion refracted through determination. The team's monitors went dark one by one, as if conceding that analysis had limits. The GP25's carbon body reflected the fluorescent pit lights like a wounded animal's eye. Outside, fans chanted his name without knowing whether it was comfort or reminder. Pecco smiled once, a small crooked gesture that looked less like gratitude and more like endurance. Maybe control is just another illusion, he thought, tracing a finger along the edge of his visor. Around him, MotoGP continued spinning its high-speed theater, indifferent and magnificent. The sport that had made him a legend was now asking him to become something less human to survive it. A journalist described his exit from the paddock as measured, but those who saw him up close knew they were watching a man trying not to shatter. The Ducati truck door closed with a metallic thud that echoed across the empty pit lane. And in that sound, sharp, final, unadorned, ended not just a weekend, but a chapter of belief.